Thank you. Oops. All right, I'd like to call this work session to order on AO 2021-33S as amended. Let's start with a roll call, please.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
Miss Allard? Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy?
Ms. Kennedy is excused.
Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Ms. Zolotel?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. As normal, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat. If you can't access the chat, please text me and I'll add you into the queue. So a couple meetings ago, this ordinance that we have for this work session was postponed, and it was suggested that we take it to a work session to hash out any issues that have come up. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to the sponsors. I understand just a few minutes ago we got emailed some amendments for this. So if the sponsors, if you want to talk us through these amendments and anything else you'd like, then I'll open it up to discussion from the members.
Good morning, everyone. We didn't really identify who was going to talk first or say anything. Could we, do we have Dennis or Dean on with us? I don't see either of them. Okay. John, Suzanne, do you think it's good that we should just share the amendments on the screen and walk through them and the rationales?
I think so. And don't we have a third, or John, you had one, I think that may have already been introduced at the last meeting. I can't quite recall.
Yeah, I don't know if we brought it up or if it was there, I have to admit. I think it was handed out.
Okay, so I'm going to try
I'll try to
share.
bring that. Why don't you do the ones, do the ones Dean just sent, and I'll dig up the other one.
Yeah,
Okay.
You want to do the first, Meg? I can do the second.
Sure, I'll try to share my screen here and we'll see how well this goes. Oh, that's interesting. It's just spinning. Jennifer, do you happen to have them handy?
Sure. If you'd give me just a couple minutes, Meg, I'll get the first one up.
Great. I guess we could talk about them just generally. They're in your email. One is simply a titles change. I guess I'll talk about that one. Well, or Ms. LaFrance, do you want to jump in here and talk about the title change?
Sure. And that one, actually, I see we have Mr. Haddon on, and that was a suggestion that he had made concerning changing it from emergency and expedited procurements to strike the and expedited to make it emergency procurements and waiver of formal procurement procedures to better match the purpose of it. And actually, if I may ask Mr. Haddon to comment or to explain further.
Thank you, and through the chair, Ms. LaFrance. I suggested that because I think it just clarifies what we're doing is that we're really waiving the formal procedures of Title VII. For instance, we'd be waiving the either competition requirements or the bidding time, or maybe the sole source procurement authority, depending upon what it is, the acquisition that we're actually doing. And that was my suggestion for changing of the title.
Thanks, Mr. Haddon. I guess back to you, Meg.
Sure. And so there you can see it. Jennifer shared it with us. It now reads emergency procurements and waiver of formal procurement procedures. So the additional amendment we have is one that is a notice provision. And this is in response to comments we heard during debate on the ordinance before it was postponed about how we would have the opportunity as the assembly to know when the waiver provision, which currently exists in code and would be moved into this section, how we would know it was being invoked, and then what response the assembly could have to the waiver having been invoked. So this says waivers granted under A2, which is the existing section in code moved over to this particular section, so everything's in one spot, shall be reported in writing to the assembly within 24 hours of issuance. The assembly may revoke a waiver by resolution. And so I think it pretty much speaks for itself. I hope it addressed the concerns we heard during debate. And those are the two primary changes that we've made to the ordinance. So we would open it up for any questions or to hear additional concerns so that we can have an opportunity to address them prior to Tuesday night.
Great, thank you. I want to note for the record that we've been joined by Ms. Allard. All right, I'm going to start with you, Mr. Haddon, and then if anyone else wants to chime in, please put yourself in the queue.
I'm already in the queue. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rivera, and through the chair. I would not be in favor of this amendment because, quite frankly, when we're using A2, time is of the essence. And if I have to notify the assembly and then you decide you revoke it, chances are I've already gone forward with the acquisition and I may already be have awarded the contract for whatever this particular emergency had to be, because these are typically time sensitive. We've got for instance, we have a plant that may be down that I've got to put a part in, or we've got a road where we've had a water main break that we are actually tearing up the road and repairing the water main. We already have the requirement to notify you at the next assembly meeting that we have waived the requirements for this specific acquisition. That's it for my comments.
Thanks. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, my question slightly changes now that Mr. Haddon has put his hat on the table there. I had, before this meeting, emailed Dean and asked if I could work on such an amendment, and he said, oh, it's being introduced. So I think that there is broad support probably for ensuring some kind of check on the process, as opposed to an after the fact notification when it's too late to do anything about it. You know, Mr. Haddon, really the question is for you. You know, the current system we have predisposes good faith operations by all parties. And while there has been a long history of that, doesn't mean there will always be that. And so if not this, then what is a better solution than just 2 weeks down the road telling the assembly we did this and you have no choice or no say in ensuring that this was actually an emergency?
May I comment, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, that was a question to you.
Go ahead.
Yes, I think there has to be a predisposition that there is a good faith effort and that the procurement officer is not going to abuse this process, and that the mayor has a check on it also, because you know, just because purchasing and the department want to use this process, the mayor ultimately makes that decision on whether this is in fact in a circumstance that requires waiving Title VII. And I understand your concern and comment, but I think there still needs to be a predisposition that there is a good faith effort on the part of the departments and purchasing before we go down this path.
But Ron, Mr. Chair, I'll follow up on that. That's not the issue I think we're talking about. So assuming that I and everyone else believes you are acting in good faith, is there a scenario in which the 8th floor could force upon you or your successors that you must do this or we're going to fire you, and it's to the benefit of their people, and there's an issue there?
Mr. Chair, I don't have a comment for Mr. Constant's suggestion.
Okay, so just for my part, I want you to understand it's not a question of the procurement department's good faith efforts. It's a question of the political entities.
Thank you. Mr. Gates?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm doing a sound check first. Did you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I wanted to also comment, and Mr. Haddon's points are really well taken. As the purchasing officer, he's got experience in these things happening, and I think that generally what he said is these things are very rare in the first place. I think there is a predisposition to believe there's good faith on the part of purchasing officer of the department that's asking for this, and the mayor the mayor weaves in writing. I think though that Mr. Constant also has some good point that this just sort of embodies the notion in our system of government that there's checks and balances between the legislative branch and the executive branch, or vice versa. The executive branch action, a check and balance by the legislative branch. I also wanted to note that, Mr. Haddon used an example about an emergency, but this amendment actually, it only refers to A2. And if you look at the ordinance, A1 is when the mayor determines in writing that an emergency threatening public health exists and, do an emergency procurement. So this 24-hour notification and the ability to rescind that waiver, it's not in place for A1 when there's a really bona fide emergency that we know everybody's going to identify in good faith. This is when there's A2 and it's not an emergency, it's when time is of the essence and best interest of the municipality. And A2 is the subsection that, the sponsors wanted him, well, actually it's, it sort of moves that repealed subsection up here. But really, this is when it's not an emergency, but we don't have time to go through the whole formal procurement process. And when, there's an intent from the funding source that funds be expended expeditiously. So A2, I think, is a different situation than the emergency where things need to be done quickly. And then I sort of wanted to add, the reason I asked to comment is this. I think that when you're in this situation, you've either got a mess on your hands already. That's why you need to waive procurement, formal procurement procedures, because you've either got a mess on your hands or timing is too important to go through the formal procedures. And if that's the case, well, if the assembly comes back with this resolution to, I guess, rescind the mayor's waiver, that just is another piece of the mess, and it will work out. If the contract's already been awarded and its work is going forward, I think part of the remedy, if the assembly passes a resolution, and if they have good counsel working in good faith, which I think they usually do, that would be part of this resolution that the assembly is approving to rescind that waiver. Part of that remedy is recognizing the contract that's already been awarded. We would have that information in front of you, right? So if work's already being done, it's like, oh, we're not going to pay them now. I think part of the remedy is also working in good faith to make sure that whatever's already been done under the waiver is taken care of, and going forward, we'll have a formal procedure instead, so I don't think it's going to be an immediate making the mess worse sort of situation. So I hope that makes some sense. And
Great, thank you.
Oh,
Ms. Zalatow?
I'm sorry, one last comment.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Gates.
And, because these are exceptions to what our charter says is competitive procurement being required, that all of this is going to be very rarely used. The mayor's waiver is going to be very rarely used. And even more rare then is going to be the assembly exercising that check and balance by rescinding that waiver under A2. So I think, though, it's sort of like lawyers, you need them, and they're thankful when you do need them to do something. So we want this language here so that when it's needed, it's in place already. Not one that's going to be exercised very often. And when I say that, I'm thinking like once every 5 years, once a decade, once every 10 emergencies, I don't know.
Thanks, Mr. Gates. Ms. Zalatow?
Thank you. So I think Mr. Gates pointed out something that, I think is interesting. I think there's, that we're already in a mess kind of waiver, but then there are waivers where time is of the essence, where procurement rules, which often take weeks or months, would frustrate the purpose. And so I think there are different levels of timing. Mr. Haddon was nice enough to share a few examples of waiver requests that had been submitted previously by purchasing. And when those are submitted, one thing that could happen is that the assembly is simply copied on the memorandum, and then the mayor provides the approval or disapproval notice both to Mr. Haddon or purchasing, as well as the assembly. I think that the point that Mr. Gates also makes about us passing a resolution after the fact in good faith, it helps provide direction and clarity on when time is of the essence, and this provision should be invoked. When we simply are provided something a couple of weeks later, and there isn't currently a formal mechanism to suggest that we don't approve, this allows us that opportunity to be the balance of power, even if we have to go ahead and honor things to date. So I think this remedies maybe an issue we weren't 100% aware that we had, but also brings it in line with the other 4 provisions in this chapter or this section, which, if the assembly is looking to waive procurement rules, we have to do so by a vote. And then similarly, in an emergency, we have to vote to provide the mayor that power. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whittleton?
Oh, I think Meg addressed my point there. It's just if the letter goes out, send it to, I would think just the chair, but maybe the whole assembly is a CC. Meg fleshed it out much better than I did. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, the thing that Meg also just really highlighted so very well is that in the system of checks and balances, the mayor has a check on the assembly's action with a veto, but in this order, the assembly has no check on the mayor's power. And that is the fundamental problem that we are looking at, because by code, we're granting the absolute power to say, this is an emergency, and, my procurement team, you're going to do this or I'm going to fire you and put someone else in here to do it. And there's nothing we could do.
Thank you. Mr. Buckenstead?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I think I wanted to just provide a couple of thoughts and comments from the administration's perspective on this. And I hope you all take that in the way that I think this might come across as not being in that spirit, which is to say, that I fully believe that we are trying to solve a problem that actually doesn't exist. I think we can all, in our heads, come up with the worst possible situation in which a mayor or a purchasing officer or somebody threatens to fire somebody if you don't do this. At least in my memory, I've never experienced or witnessed that here. And I would assume that if something like that did happen, there are other recourses or different recourse to prevent that and or have the assembly engaged with the administration in a way that ultimately protects both the procurement officer, but also deals with what I would think would probably be unethical or illegal behavior by a mayor doing that. The other thing that I would comment on is that I'm struggling to see the situation with the I guess it's sections 3 and 4 in there, which are the assembly passing by resolution something that waives procurement code. Well, the assembly is always welcome and always able to pass any resolution that they want. That doesn't mean that if the mayor ultimately doesn't think that we are in an emergency or that procurement code needs to be waived, that the assembly passing said resolution is going to force the mayor to do that, because the administration and the executive branch are still the ones that are ultimately in charge of the procurement process. So certainly, I think there are probably ways and language that we can include in there that improves the overall notification of some of these issues to the assembly, either in the form of simultaneous notification or CC to the chair or the rest of the assembly, or kind of mandate that there is a more comprehensive, I think, reasoning that is passed on that actually lays out very concretely the reasons why we're doing this. But I'm struggling really to see what problem it is that we're ultimately trying to fix, because we've always had this power in code. The mayor's always had this ability to do this, and it just seems strange that we're trying to include the assembly in what I view, and I think the administration views, as a purely administrative issue, which is procurement.
Thank you. Mr. Gates? If you're trying to speak, Mr. Gates, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to unmute. I already answered. I heard a few various ways that notification for the assembly could be given, and I just wanted to mention that generally it's done by, you might see a CC to all assembly members to the chair, but that would basically go to the municipal clerk and distributed from the municipal clerk to all members. That's sort of the normal and customary process. It doesn't need a meeting, I guess, is what I wanted to make sure we understood.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Just pushing back on the idea that procurement is a function of the executive. We approve expenditures, we approve contracts, we approve all of these things. So it is in fact a duty in our hands to ensure fidelity. And so I don't see how that falls into just one house of this great organization.
Thank you. Mr. Bakken said you had a reply.
I do, through the chair, Assembly Member Constant, and that was my comments were solely on the what I would consider the front end of the procurement process, which is putting the RFP, RFQ, whatever it is, out on the street. Obviously, ultimately, the assembly approves whatever the administration brings forward in the form of a contract. We're talking about a very narrow, very small subset of those that we would be determining in the case of an emergency, that we would be saying we're waiving this, but ultimately at the same time, the assembly would be made aware of those. So if it came across that I don't see any involvement from the assembly, that is not what I was trying to say. Certainly, typically you guys have to approve those. I was just talking about this particular ordinance and those particular provisions.
Right, and the fundamental issue is that this particular section of code does take the assembly out of the equation completely and says, we're going to send you a letter, but you have no recourse. That's the sticking point.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Well, thanks. You know, as we've worked on this over a few weeks here, you know, I've learned a lot of this we can already do. I mean, the mayor can do. So number one, I mean, a lot of the emergency procurement, it can be the one-offs that Mr. Haddon most often does, but it could be something broader. You know, like go vaccinate everyone, and we're going to streamline procurement for that. And two, broadens that a bit so that in cases like we've seen in the last year that might not fit precisely in one, that power is there. But then, you know, I agree with Jason. Anytime we can do a resolution that does what 3 and 4 say. So we're kind of saying what we already can do. When these things would apply, and we think like the CARES Act funding, okay, we have certain allocations. And it seems like the time to do that is instead of a separate resolution, as part of that resolution, we do these allocations, and we find that if any of these need to be done by a certain date, that, you know, part of that allocation would say, and you can, you know, streamline procurement rules. So we can do this on a more of a case-by-case basis, because, you know, I agree with Jason, this just says what we can do. We can do resolutions on anything at any time. So I don't know that 3 and 4 are truly necessary. I think the notification part is valuable in streamlining that. And then there's also, we've streamlined the code a little bit here by deleting one section and bringing that into here. So that's good, and the change in the title. But I do wonder if 3 and 4 are really necessary. You know, it's something that we can already do, and it would be more natural, it seems, to do it as part of, you know, an allocation of spending that might face the, you know, time constraints that 3 and 4 contemplate. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Vogel?
Thank you. I had 2 comments. One is, I was wondering if there are any examples that anyone is aware of other legislative branches taking on this particular oversight role, and in particular the sort of clawback ability. And I guess so that's a question, just wondering if we have any examples of this elsewhere. And then my second is more of a comment, which is a little bit of concern that the ability to enter into time is of the essence contract, and, you know, whatever rule is being contemplated to be waived, so a shorter period, something like that, the sort of having the open, and this can be undone at the next assembly meeting by resolution, I think it might make it harder to fulfill the contract or have the other party be willing to bid in that emergency situation, because you're injecting more uncertainty into the municipality's ability to enter into the contract. And you're potentially doing that in precisely the sort of procurement emergency, time is of the essence moments where we don't want to be turning away or we don't want to be harming the ability of the municipality to enter into those agreements. So those are my 2 comment questions.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the Assembly can call ourselves in an emergency meeting if we feel it's necessary. We've done that on a couple of occasions right after the earthquake, as I recall. And so, you know, we could react to something once we were notified through a mass email, and you know, get together and try to you know, figure out which direction we wanted to go at that point. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zalata?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to Ms. Vogel's question, I would need to check with Mr. Wheeler if he did any looking to other jurisdictions. He assisted us with this as our contract counsel for items related to COVID. So I don't have a direct answer for you there. On the concern about clawback, as I look at a few of the examples, and I'll forward this to the clerk to send along, of opportunities when waiver was requested. One was because we were approaching the end of a construction season. So it wasn't time is of the essence like 24 hours. It was more or less time is of the essence that we couldn't get through the several week process. And similarly, when I think another was when we had the Campbell Lake sewer repair project. Again, it was, and both of those, I believe, were requests for sole source contracts instead of competitively bidded contracts. So I just want to make sure that we talk about these in items or ways that are grounded in the ways that this has been used, at least historically. So in both of those, I think, you know, if we were to receive notice as an assembly that the time is of the essence, formal procurement doesn't make sense because of X, Y, and Z, and so sole source is being requested instead of the competitive process, I could still see there being some time in between, you know, that notice and the sole source being awarded. It doesn't seem like it's an immediate action. Now, there is an instance where I believe it was the water main break over on Northern Lights. That was a 24-hour instance, but that doesn't seem like it would be terribly controversial either. So I'll send these three instances on to the clerk so members can review them. But I think in operation, it still makes sense to be able to get notice. And, you know, I think we have to think about this, not just in terms of procurement, but procurement requires appropriation. You can't procure things without the appropriation. And so that takes both branches of government. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. A couple of thoughts more, and I think Meg has hit onto something of importance there. And I don't know how this could be codified, but that there are certain items that must be done within 24 hours, like the water main breaking. But then there are other items that have a different time arc. And back to Ms. Vogel's commentary about inserting the assembly by resolution after an award. I never envisioned that. And in fact, I believe once an award has been made, contract exists, and there is no place for the assembly to jump in there and say, hey, stop this after the fact. And that's why the idea of within 24 hours, the assembly could meet and or whatever the minimum notice requirements might be to affirm this question, except in certain cases where it is literally, you know, something's on fire, something's flooding, something's broken to the point where imminent harm could arise. And that actually raises the question for Mr. Haddon, if he's capable of doing this in the next couple of days, generate for us a list of the implementation of this current existing section of the code where a waiver was granted so that we can kind of assess in a concrete way how it's been implemented over the years. That might be very helpful, because in the end, I agree with you, Ms. Vogel, there's no way to undo once the contract has been awarded, and therein lies the rub of the problem.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue.
Mr. Chair, I believe we have that last amendment we had mentioned to Miss Venna-Clausen, if we want to go ahead and run through that one quick by Mr. Weddleton.
Before we flip
Sure.
over,
So before we put that one up, yeah, go ahead, Mr. Constant, before we put that one up.
yeah, I just want a commitment from the administration that they'll provide for us a list of times when this section of the code, expedited procurement because of an emergency waiver, has been done.
Would someone from the administration like to respond?
This is Ron, through the chair. Mr. Constant, we can provide that, but anecdotally, the last time we used this was, I believe, in 2019, and it was on a AWWU project, and I'll have to go back and look. We do not maintain a centralized log of all those, so it's going to take me a little time. What we do is when we get those, they go into each purchase order file.
I see. So there's no
So
record.
it will be difficult to do.
Right, and the AWW project was Campbell Lake, correct?
I believe it was Campbell Lake. I believe that was 2019. And I believe Ms. Sallard had a comment in the chat, Mr. Chair.
I don't see anything from Ms. Allard in the chat.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so let's go ahead and put that third amendment up if we could, please. And Mr. Weddleton, are you going to speak to this?
Sure. This was response to, actually, I don't quite remember who it was, someone I think on the administration or some alert person, that there can be pushback like from FEMA and places like that we're just spending willy-nilly to use whatever funds are available, and they don't like that. So we don't want to kind of have that as an impediment. So this just clarifies that, anytime we hurry up, funding from feds or the state, that it would be in accordance with the intent of it. And I guess basically it, that we're not gonna, it's not just to spend wildly, but we'll spend quickly, but doing what they want us to do with the funds.
Thank you. All right, is there any further discussion on this amendment or anything else? All right, not hearing anything, then this will be back before us on Wednesday with these three proposed amendments, plus any other amendments that get brought forward. Looking forward to the deliberation then. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll go ahead and end this work session, and I'll see everyone again at 12 noon.